I've been driving long haul for almost 20 years. You see a lot of strange things on the road. Accidents that don't make sense, cars abandoned in places no one should be, people walking along the shoulder miles from anywhere. Most of it you learn to ignore. You keep your head down, keep the wheels rolling, but every now and then something happens that sticks with you. Something you can't quite explain. It was January 2022, a bitter cold night on Highway 287, somewhere between Amarillo and Fort Worth. I was hauling a flatbed of industrial supplies, mostly steel beams and concrete mixers, for a job site in Dallas. 1:30 a.m., just me and the road, the hum of the truck's engine and the occasional reflective road sign breaking up the darkness. The world felt empty. The kind of night where the silence presses in on you, where it feels like you're the last person left alive. The kind of night where something could be waiting out there, just beyond the reach of your headlights, and you wouldn't know until it was too late. I was running on my second monster of the night, trying to keep my eyelids from feeling like lead, when I saw a pickup truck pulled off onto the shoulder, hazard lights flashing dimly in the cold Texas night. Now that in itself wasn't weird. You see plenty of stranded vehicles, could have been anything. A flat tire, an overheating engine, maybe even someone waiting for help. But as I got closer, something else caught my eye. A glint on the pavement. It was faint, just a quick flicker as my headlights swept over it. I might have ignored it if not for the way my brain instantly screamed danger. I eased off the gas, scanning the road. Then I saw them. Spikes. A whole damn row of tire spikes, stretched across both lanes, just barely visible against the dark asphalt, the kind cops use during high-speed chases, the kind meant to stop a vehicle fast. My stomach dropped. This wasn't some random accident. Someone put them there on purpose. Instinct kicked in. I tapped the brakes, careful not to slam them, heart pounding. I glanced at the pickup. The driver's side door was cracked open, but no one was inside. That was enough for me. I wasn't stopping. I yanked the wheel just enough to shift into the oncoming lane, clearing the spikes by inches. My pulse hammered against my ribs as my tires hit solid pavement again. Then, movement in my side mirror. Two figures burst out of the ditch beside the road. They were running straight for me. One of them had something in his hand, something long and heavy. A bat? A pipe? A gun? I didn't wait to find out. My foot slammed on the gas. The truck roared forward, the sudden acceleration making my trailer sway behind me. I braced for the sound of a gunshot, of shattered glass. But nothing came. I risked another glance in the mirror. The two men had stopped running. They just stood there, watching me, their faces lost in shadow. And the pickup? It was still there, hazard lights blinking like some kind of sick lure. I didn't stop until I was 10 miles up the road, my hands clenched so tight around the wheel that my knuckles ached. My heart refused to slow down. I pulled into the next truck stop I could find, barely managing to back my rig into a space before I killed the engine. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone, dialing Texas Highway Patrol. I told the dispatcher everything, the pickup, the spikes, the men. She was calm. Too calm, like she'd heard this before. "We'll send a unit to check it out," she said. "Where's your current location?" I gave her the details. She told me to stay put in case they needed more information. I hung up and just sat there, staring at the empty highway beyond the truck stop parking lot. Waiting. For what, I wasn't sure. Maybe for that truck to roll in after me. But it never did. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. It was the dispatcher. "We sent a unit out," she said, "but the truck is gone. No sign of the spikes either." I gripped the phone tighter. "You sure you checked the right spot?" A pause. "We checked," she said. "And we haven't had any similar reports from that stretch of highway." My stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she hesitated, "we've never had an incident like this out there. No road spikes, no ambushes, nothing." I didn't like that answer. I didn't like the way her voice sounded uneasy, like she wasn't telling me something. "So, you're saying this was the first time?" Another pause, a little longer this time. "As far as we know, yes." A shiver crawled up my spine. "You need anything else from me?" I asked, already knowing I wasn't going to get the reassurance I wanted. "No," she said, "but if you're heading south, Stay alert. That was the last thing I wanted to hear. I sat there a long time after that call ended, just watching the highway, thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't seen those spikes in time. If I had blown a tire, been forced to pull over, would they have just robbed me, or was it something worse? I didn't want to know. The highway stretched ahead, dark and empty, just like it had been before. Only now, it didn't feel empty. It felt like something was waiting, and worse, whatever it was, it had picked that exact night to start. Eventually, I got back on the road. I finished my route, made my delivery, but I kept thinking about it. The way those men had sprinted toward my truck. The way they had just stood there watching me as I drove away. The way the pickup was gone when the cops arrived, like it had never been there at all. For weeks after that night, I kept my eyes peeled for anything unusual. Every time I passed another stranded vehicle, I tensed up, scanning for signs of another setup. Then, about a month later, I overheard a conversation at a rest stop diner. A couple of other truckers were talking about an ambush attempt. Different highway. Same setup. Spikes on the road, a fake breakdown, masked men lying in wait. But this time, the driver had stopped, thinking he could help. He got jumped. They took everything, his wallet, his load, even his truck. It was later found abandoned miles away, stripped clean. No one ever caught the guys who did it. That conversation stuck with me. It made me realize something. There are people out there watching, waiting for an easy mark. Now, every time I see a car pulled over on a deserted stretch of highway, I slow down, not to stop, but to check. Because out there, in the middle of nowhere, you don't always get a second chance. I didn't sleep much after that night on Highway 287. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those two figures sprinting toward my truck, their faces lost in shadow, the spikes on the road catching the light. I kept thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't noticed in time, if I'd pulled over, thinking someone needed help. The worst part wasn't just that I'd almost been caught in a trap, it was knowing that those guys were still out there, waiting for someone else to take the bait. Truck stops weren't the same after that. Every time I parked for the night, I double-checked my locks, watched my mirrors, scanned the lot for anything out of place. But the road doesn't let you stay scared for long. You get back behind the wheel, you keep moving, because stopping isn't an option. And eventually I told myself, maybe that was just a freak incident. Maybe it wasn't part of something bigger. Then, about a week later, I heard Jake's story. I met Jake Mendez at a roadside diner outside Tulsa, one of those spots where truckers and late shift workers swap stories over stale coffee and rubbery eggs. He was sitting 2 booths over, talking to another driver, his voice low, serious. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but when you've just had your own brush with something you can't explain, your ears tend to pick up when someone else starts talking about a bad night on the road. He was saying something about a car that wouldn't let him go, about a driver who smiled like he was waiting for him to come back. And as soon as I heard that, I knew. I wasn't the only one. Jake was a pizza delivery guy, 27 years old, working late shifts to make ends meet. Not exactly the kind of guy you expect to run into something terrifying on the road, but he did. It happened outside Omaha, Nebraska, on a quiet stretch of back road he used to take home after work. The highway was faster, sure, but late at night the back roads were quicker and quieter. No stoplights, no drunk drivers weaving in and out of traffic. He'd been taking that same route for months without a problem. That night it was just after 1 a.m. and he was exhausted. He'd spent the last 7 hours crisscrossing the city, dropping off orders, weaving through traffic. He was looking forward to nothing but his bed. He turned onto the 2-lane road, barely thinking about anything, just letting muscle memory take over. Then, in his rearview mirror, he saw the headlights. At first it was nothing, just another car on the road, no big deal. But as the minutes passed, he realized something was off. The car wasn't just behind him, it was too close. Jake tapped his brakes lightly, a polite signal. "Back off, buddy." Nothing. The car didn't slow, didn't fall back. If anything, it crept closer. His hands tightened on the wheel. "All right, road rage, just go around me." He moved into the right lane, expecting the car to pass. Instead, it stayed with him, matched his speed. Didn't move. He flicked his eyes to the mirror, trying to see who was behind the wheel, but the headlights were too bright, blinding him. His stomach twisted. This wasn't normal. He eased up to 55 pf just to see what would happen. The car did the same. His heart started pounding. He reached for his phone in the cup holder, thinking about calling someone, maybe even 911. But what would he say? Hey, there's a car following me? That wasn't illegal. That wasn't an emergency. But everything in him was screaming, this is wrong. Then the car swerved hard, cutting him off. Jake jerked the wheel, tires screeching as he swerved onto the shoulder. His whole body lurched forward, seatbelt digging into his chest. The car didn't pull ahead, it just sat there, blocking the road. Jake's breath came fast, sharp, his knuckles were white on the wheel. What the hell was this? Then the brake lights flicked off. The car started crawling forward, slowly, like it was waiting for him to follow. Jake didn't want to follow, he wanted out. He threw the car into reverse, backing up, heart hammering against his ribs. If he could turn around, he could get back to the city, to streetlights, to people. But the second he swerved into the opposite lane, the headlights flashed on. Then the car raced toward him. Jake's body reacted before his brain did. He slammed on the gas, shooting forward, his tires skidding on the pavement. The car was right behind him, keeping up, keeping pace. The road twisted through dark farmland, no streetlights, no houses, nothing but endless black stretching ahead of him. He took a sharp left onto another road, nearly losing control, his car skidding as he tried to correct. The second he did, he checked the mirror. Still there. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Why wouldn't they stop? He floored it. The car stayed close. No honking, no flashing lights, no signals, just relentless pursuit. Then, finally, he saw it. A gas station, glowing in the dark, the only sign of life for miles. Jake didn't slow down. He whipped into the lot, tires screeching, nearly hitting a pump as he threw the car into. He barely managed to kill the engine before he was out the door, running for the store. The clerk looked up, startled, but Jake didn't stop moving until he was inside, panting, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. The clerk frowned. You okay, man? Jake didn't answer, because through the store's glass windows, he could see the road. The car was back. It was rolling past the gas station, slowly. He squinted, his stomach knotting up so tight he thought he might be sick. For the first time, he saw the driver's face. A middle-aged man, just a regular guy, wearing a jacket, nothing strange, nothing alarming, but when their eyes met, the man smiled. Not a mocking smile, not a friendly smile, a knowing smile, like he was waiting, like he knew something Jake didn't. Jake didn't move, he didn't breathe. The car rolled past the station, disappeared down the road, and just like that, it was gone. Jake stayed inside the gas station for an hour, watching, waiting. But the car never came back. Eventually, he drove home, taking a different route, just in case. He never saw the car again, but he never forgot the way that man looked at him, like he was expecting him to come back. And maybe, just maybe, he still is. I sat in my truck for a long time after hearing Jake's story. I don't know what unsettled me more. The way the driver had smiled at him, like he was in on some sick game, or the fact that these things were happening to different people in different places, but with the same eerie pattern. I'd spent years on the road convincing myself that most of what I saw, strange figures on the roadside, cars parked in the middle of nowhere, random headlights appearing in my rear view, could be explained. But now, I wasn't so sure. Jake wasn't just some conspiracy theorist or attention seeker, he was just a guy trying to get home. And that night, someone, or something, had picked him. I thought about it the whole way to my next stop, a truck stop diner outside of Reno, Nevada. That's where I met Megan Calloway. She was sitting alone in a booth, stirring a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She wasn't a trucker, she wasn't even supposed to be here. But something had shaken her bad enough that she pulled off the highway and didn't want to get back on. She told me she was driving home from a visit with family, taking the long stretch of Highway 50, also called the loneliest road in America. The name was fitting, miles and miles of nothing. Just empty road cutting through the desert, barely any signs of life. Megan hadn't seen another car for almost an hour when her gas light blinked on. She'd been meaning to stop at a station earlier, but she kept telling herself just a little farther. Now she was in the middle of nowhere with no choice but to stop at the next available gas station. Then she saw it, a small, run-down gas station sitting just off the highway. The neon sign buzzed weakly, flickering between open and a mess of broken letters. No cars in the lot, no other travelers, just the station, sitting alone in the dark. Megan hesitated. Normally she'd keep driving. Something about places like this never sat right with her, but she was running on fumes, so she pulled in. The station had two ancient gas pumps and a small convenience store attached. The windows were dark except for a dim yellow light inside, but as she parked, she saw a figure behind the counter, an elderly woman with tired eyes and gray hair tied back in a loose bun. Megan exhaled. At least she wasn't alone. She stepped out, rubbing her arms against the cold. The night was eerily quiet. No sound of passing cars, no wind, just the low hum of the buzzing sign. She slid her card into the pump. Nothing. Tried again, still nothing. With a sigh, she headed toward the store. The door chimed as she stepped inside. The woman behind the counter looked up from a newspaper. Her expression didn't change. She just watched as Megan approached. Megan forced a smile. "Pump 1, please." The woman didn't move, didn't blink. Then, in a voice so low it barely reached Megan's ears, she said, "Get back in your car. Leave. Don't look back." Megan frowned. "Excuse me?" The woman's face was still, expressionless, but her eyes were filled with something close to fear. Megan let out a nervous laugh, glancing around, expecting some kind of punchline. Is the pump broken?" The woman just shook her head, slowly, deliberately. Not no, not yes, just a slow, don't ask. That was when Megan felt it, that crawling sensation on the back of her neck, like she was being watched. She turned toward the glass door, her own reflection staring back at her, and then movement. Two shadows appeared behind the gas station, stepping into the dim glow of the security light. Megan's breath caught in her throat. Two men, one tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dirty flannel, the other thinner, his hood pulled up tight. They hadn't been there when she pulled in. They had been waiting. The tall one took a step forward, not rushed, not frantic, just steady, confident, like he knew she wasn't going anywhere. Megan spun back toward the counter, her heart hammering. The woman's face hadn't changed, but this time, her voice was even quieter. "Don't look at them, just go." Megan didn't hesitate. She yanked the door open and sprinted toward her car. She could hear them moving fast now, their boots crunching against gravel. She fumbled for her keys, her hands shaking. "Come on, come on, come on." The tall one was already halfway across the lot. His pace wasn't rushed, it was certain. Megan threw herself into her car, slammed the lock button and jammed the key into the ignition. The moment she turned it, her headlights flicked on. And that's when she saw their faces. The tall one smirked. The hooded one stared straight into her eyes. Not angry, not threatening, just watching, like they had been watching for a long time. Then the tall one lunged. Bam! His hand slammed against the driver's side window. Megan screamed, flooring the gas pedal. Her tires screeched as she whipped the car backward, nearly hitting the hooded man. But he didn't flinch. He just stood there, still watching. Megan threw the car into drive and gunned it. The gas station blurred behind her. She gripped the wheel so tight her fingernails dug into her palms. She didn't slow down, didn't look back. Not until she reached the next town, nearly 40 miles away. When she finally pulled into another gas station, one with lights, people, safety, her hands were still shaking. She told the attendant everything. He listened, and then, with a long, tired sigh, he said, "Yeah, you're not the first." Megan's stomach nodded. Did anyone ever get caught? The attendant's jaw tensed. He didn't answer right away. Then, finally, "Every time we check, there's no one there." Megan left the station without another word. She never took Highway 50 again. But sometimes, when she's alone at night, she thinks about the old woman behind the counter, the way she had just shaken her head, slowly, like she had seen it all before, like she had warned others, and maybe, just maybe, some of them didn't listen. I didn't get back on the road right away after hearing Megan's story. Something about it stuck with me. The way the old woman at the gas station had warned her, the way those men had been waiting, how they weren't in a rush because they'd done this before. It made my stomach twist. It reminded me too much of what had happened to me back on Highway 287 and what had happened to Jake with the shadow car. It wasn't just bad luck. It wasn't a one-time thing. It was a pattern, and it wasn't stopping. I kept thinking about it even after I left that diner, even after I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that I was just reading too much into things. But then I met Ryan Brooks. I was at a truck stop outside Asheville, North Carolina, sitting at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee, when Ryan sat down next to me. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. The kind of tired that settles into your bones, not just from exhaustion, but from something worse. We got to talking, like road people do, and eventually the conversation drifted toward those weird things you see when you drive at night, the things that don't make sense. I told him about the spikes in the road, about the men in the ditch. He listened, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. Then he told me his story. Ryan wasn't a trucker, he was an Uber driver, working late-night shifts to make extra cash. He liked the late-night rides, fewer drunks than you'd expect, quieter roads, better fares. Most nights were uneventful. Until that night. It started with a long pickup, a guy coming in from the airport, heading home, 40-minute drive, rural area, middle of nowhere. Easy money. Ryan didn't think much of it. The guy barely talked, just muttered a, "Hey, how's your night?" before zoning out on his phone. The drop-off was uneventful, just a dark house at the end of a long driveway, surrounded by trees. But the drive back, that was where things went wrong. Ryan had just pulled back onto the main road when he saw it. A sedan, maybe 20 yards ahead, moving slow. At first, he figured it was some lost driver looking for a turnoff. He went to pass them. The sedan swerved hard in front of him. Ryan slammed on his brakes. What the hell? The road was too narrow to go around, so he stayed put, watching. The sedan sat there for a moment. Then, it inched forward. Ryan let it go ahead, keeping a few car lengths between them. Maybe it was just some paranoid driver, someone being weird, no big deal. Then the brake lights flashed on, and the car stopped, right in the middle of the road. No hazards, no turn signals. Just waiting. Ryan's stomach twisted. This wasn't right. His first thought was that the driver needed help. Maybe their car had broken down, maybe they were having a medical emergency. He flicked on his high beams. That's when he saw it. The sedan wasn't stalled. The driver was watching him. Ryan's pulse kicked up. His fingers tightened on the wheel. Something deep in his gut whispered, "Go, now." He threw his car into reverse, backing up slowly. Then the reverse lights on the sedan blinked on. They were backing up too. Ryan didn't wait. He slammed the gear into drive and gunned it. The sedan shot forward too. It was a game now. Ryan's heart pounded as he hit 60, then 70. The road was dark, twisting through the Blue Ridge Mountains. Nothing but trees and night on either side. No houses, no streetlights, just him and them. He kept glancing at the mirror, trying to get a clear look at the driver, but the headlights were too bright, hiding their face. Then the sedan cut the wheel, blocking the road again. Ryan barely had time to react. He slammed on the brakes, tires screaming against the asphalt. His car skidded, came within inches of hitting them. The sedan just sat there. No movement, no one got out. Ryan's breath came fast and shaky. His brain raced for an answer. What the hell was happening? Then, after a long, agonizing moment, the brake lights flicked off, and the car sped away like it had never been there at all. Ryan sat there shaking, heart hammering against his ribs. Then, with a deep breath, he put the car in drive and started moving again. 2 miles later, he saw it. The sedan was waiting again, pulled onto the shoulder, engine off. Just sitting there. Ryan gritted his teeth. He wasn't stopping, not again. He pressed the gas, pushing past them as fast as he could. As he did, he turned his head, just for a split second, and saw the driver's face, a middle-aged man. Just a normal guy. No mask, no scars, no wild expression. Just a man in a jacket, smiling. Then, as Ryan sped past, the man lifted a hand and waved. Not frantic, not mocking, just a slow, deliberate wave, like he knew him, like he was saying, "Next time." Ryan didn't look back. He drove until he saw a gas station, pulling in so fast his tires squealed. He killed the engine, sat there, breathing hard, his hands still clenched on the wheel. After a minute, he forced himself inside. The clerk, mid-yawn, barely glanced at him. "You okay, man?" Ryan didn't answer. He turned toward the window instead, and his stomach turned to ice. The sedan was back, rolling slowly past the station. Ryan pressed himself against the wall, his breath catching in his throat. The clerk frowned. "Dude," Ryan held up a hand, "just hold on." The car kept rolling. Ryan watched. He prayed he wouldn't see it, but there, the driver, looking at him, smiling, waving, and then the sedan drove off, just like that. Ryan stayed in that gas station for nearly an hour, waiting, but the sedan never came back. He eventually took a different route home, but for weeks after that night, every time he looked in his rearview mirror, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, that car was still following him. After hearing Ryan's story about the waiting car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. It wasn't just one bad encounter on a dark road. It wasn't just paranoia creeping in during the late hours of the night. These stories, mine, Jake's, Megan's, Ryan's, they weren't random. They were connected. I didn't know how, not yet, but I knew one thing for sure. People were being hunted. Maybe not in the way you think. This wasn't some backwoods psycho with an axe. This wasn't some cheap slasher movie where the killer wears a mask and jumps out from behind the trees. This was something calculated, deliberate. Like whoever was out there playing with people on the road wasn't just looking to hurt them, they were looking to watch, to see what their victims would do. And I got the feeling that one night, someone wasn't going to make it out alive. That's why, when I met Hannah Blake, I knew immediately that she had a story of her own. We crossed paths at a gas station outside Phoenix, Arizona. She looked young, maybe early 20s, standing at the coffee machine with shaky hands, spilling sugar onto the counter as she tried to stir her drink. I recognized that look, the look of someone who had seen something they couldn't explain. I made small talk, asked if she was all right. She hesitated, then said, "You ever see something on the road you know shouldn't be there?" I told her more than once. That's when she told me about the hitchhiker. Hannah had been driving home from a weekend trip with friends. Just her, the open highway, and a 6-hour stretch of desert road. She had taken Route 93, a long, lonely stretch that cut through the Arizona wilderness, miles of nothing but sand, scrub, and silence. It was around midnight when she first saw her. A woman standing by the side of the road, alone, waving. Hannah's first thought was that maybe she had broken down somewhere. That's what made sense. But something about her didn't look right. She wasn't standing near a car. She was barefoot, and her clothes, they were all wrong. A thin summer dress, light-colored, too clean for someone stranded on a desert highway. Hannah slowed down, instinct screaming at her not to stop. But as she got closer, the woman stared directly at her and started walking toward the car, not running, not waving desperately, just walking. Too fast, like her feet weren't quite touching the ground. Hannah's chest tightened. She didn't think. She hit the gas. The woman's face flashed in her headlights for half a second. Too pale, too smooth, too wrong. Then she was gone. Hannah's heart slammed against her ribs as she sped past, hands gripping the wheel so hard her knuckles ached. She forced herself to breathe, to calm down. Maybe she'd imagined it. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe then, up ahead, the woman was there again, still on the side of the road, still waving. Hannah's stomach dropped. It wasn't possible. She'd left her half a mile behind. She hadn't passed any turnoffs. But there she was. Hannah didn't slow down. She kept driving, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. She gripped the wheel tighter, kept her eyes forward. She wasn't going to look again. She wasn't going to... She glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the woman standing in the middle of the road behind her, still smiling, still waving, like she knew Hannah would look back. Hannah let out a sharp gasp, her body going cold. She kept driving, faster. The road stretched ahead, dark and endless. Her hands shook on the wheel. She was alone, out here, and yet she knew she wasn't. Hannah drove for nearly an hour, never once looking back, never once daring to check her mirrors again. She only stopped when she saw the lights of a gas station ahead. She pulled in too fast, tires screeching against the pavement. She barely remembered turning the key, throwing the car into park. She just sat there, hands gripping the wheel, breathing hard. After a minute, she forced herself to move. She needed to be around people. She stepped inside. The gas station was quiet, just the clerk behind the counter, an older man with deep lines on his face, cleaning a coffee pot. She walked up, her voice shaky. "Hey, have you ever seen a woman standing out there? On the highway?" The man didn't look up. He kept scrubbing the pot, speaking low. "You're not the first." Hannah's blood went cold. She swallowed hard. "What does that mean?" The man finally looked at her. His eyes were dark, tired, like he'd heard this before, like he knew exactly what she was talking about. Every couple months, someone comes in asking about her. Hannah's stomach tightened. "So who is she?" The man shook his head. "Nobody knows, but she's been out there for a long time." Hannah's pulse thundered. The man kept talking. "Sometimes people stop." Her breath caught. "Sometimes they don't make it here." Hannah's chest tightened. "What happens to them?" The man's expression didn't change. "They just disappear." Hannah stood there, frozen, the weight of those words settling deep in her bones. She didn't ask any more questions. She didn't want the answers. She just nodded, backed away, and left the station. She never drove that road again, but sometimes, when she's on a quiet stretch of highway, miles from anywhere, she'll catch herself glancing in the mirror, and she swears, just for a second, she sees a woman standing by the road. Still smiling, still waving, like she's waiting for her to come back. After hearing Hannah's story about the hitchhiker, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening out here on these roads, it wasn't just random. It wasn't just bad luck. It wasn't just a few isolated incidents that happened to people like me, Jake, Megan, Ryan, and now Hannah. There was something waiting out here. Something that picked its victims carefully, and as I listened to Hannah talk, watched her hands shake against her coffee cup, I realized something. We had all escaped, but how many hadn't? That thought stuck with me as I left Arizona, heading east, following my next long-haul job through Mississippi. I drove for hours, pushing the thought away, telling myself to focus on the road, on the next stop, on the miles stretching ahead of me. Then I met Nathan Fielder. We crossed paths at a roadside diner outside of Jackson, Mississippi. He was sitting alone in the corner, his plate barely touched, staring at the window like he expected something to be waiting outside. I knew that look. I had seen it in my own reflection. I sat down across from him, and after a few minutes of quiet conversation, he told me his story. Nathan had been driving home from a work trip, heading back to Georgia. It was late past 2 a.m., and he was exhausted, the kind of tired where the road starts blurring together, the white lines stretching endlessly into the dark. He had planned to drive straight through, but his eyes kept drooping. He knew he needed to stop just for a few hours, just enough to keep from running himself off the road. That's when he saw it. A motel sign glowing in the distance just off the highway. It was old, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 80s. But it was open, and that was all that mattered. Nathan pulled in, the parking lot nearly empty except for one other car, an older model sedan parked near the office. He stepped inside. The clerk was already waiting, a man in his late 50s, thin, with tired eyes and a voice that felt too quiet for the empty lobby. Nathan asked for a room. The clerk hesitated for half a second, just long enough to notice, then slid the key across the counter. Room 17A. Nathan paid in cash, took the key, and headed outside. As he walked past the other car in the lot, something felt off. The windows were too dark, tinted, or maybe just filthy, but he could feel someone sitting inside, watching. He hurried to his room, telling himself he was just being paranoid. The room was exactly what he expected. Stale air, faded wallpaper, a TV that looked like it hadn't worked in years. He locked the door, slid the chain into place, and set his bag down on the flimsy wooden dresser. Then, just as he was kicking off his shoes, footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate. Nathan froze. The footsteps stopped right outside his door. Then, the doorknob rattled. His breath caught in his throat. He stood completely still, heart hammering. The chain jingled slightly, like someone was testing it. Then, silence. Nathan didn't move. He didn't breathe. He stayed there, listening, waiting. Minutes passed. Then, just barely, he heard it, the footsteps moving away. He didn't sleep after that, just sat there in bed, clutching his phone, listening to the silence outside. When the sun finally started rising, he decided he had enough. He grabbed his bag, barely taking the time to check the mirror before heading to the door. Then he stopped. Something was wrong. The car from last night was gone, but the space where it had been parked was still wet, not from rain, from something else. Nathan's stomach twisted. He hurried to the front desk, finding a different clerk behind the counter, a woman this time, younger, with a bored expression. He cleared his throat. "Hey, the guy who was working last night, is he still here?" The woman frowned. "What guy?" Nathan felt his skin crawl. "The night clerk. The man who checked me in." She shook her head. "We don't have a night clerk." Nathan felt cold. "So, who gave me this?" He held up the key to room 107. The woman stared at it. Then she turned to the wall of keys behind her. Nathan followed her gaze. Room 117's key was still hanging there, untouched, like it had never been given out at all. Nathan didn't wait to ask more questions. He dropped the key on the counter, turned, and walked out. He didn't look back, didn't stop moving until he was in his car, engine roaring to life, tires kicking up dust as he peeled out of the lot. He didn't breathe again until he was miles down the highway, and even then, he felt like something was still watching him. Even now, sitting across from me, his hands still trembled slightly as he told the story. I didn't know what to say, because I knew exactly how he felt, and I knew he wasn't crazy. We all had stories. We all had moments where the road had turned against us. I don't know what's out there. I don't know if it's people playing some sick game. I don't know if it's something else, something older. Something that's been watching highways and waiting for victims for longer than any of us could imagine. But I know this. I don't ignore the signs anymore. I don't stop for stranded cars. I don't take empty roads alone if I can help it. And if I ever check into a motel again, I make sure there's a record that I was actually there. Because whatever is out there, it doesn't just want to scare us. It doesn't just want to chase us off the road. It wants to make sure no one ever remembers we were here at all. If there's one thing I've learned from these stories, it's this: the road isn't always just a road. It's a place where people vanish without a trace, where headlights appear in your mirror and never leave, where things stand on the side of the highway that shouldn't exist at all. For most of us, driving is routine. We get behind the wheel, we follow the familiar roads, we assume we're safe because we're in control. But the truth is, we're never really alone out there. Maybe it's bad people, maybe it's something worse, but whatever it is, it's watching, it's waiting. Lessons to remember: trust your instincts. Every single person in these stories had a moment, that split second where something didn't feel right, and when they listened to that instinct, they survived. The next time you get that uneasy feeling on the road, don't ignore it. Never stop for strangers. Whether it's a hitchhiker standing by the road, a car with its hazards on, or a person waving for help, think twice before stopping. Some traps look like emergencies, but some emergencies are traps. Avoid isolated areas at night. Empty highways, dark gas stations, deserted motels. These are places where bad things happen. If you can, stick to well-lit, populated areas. If you're low on gas, fill up before you reach the middle of nowhere. Watch for patterns. Some of these encounters, like the ambush on the highway or the waiting car, aren't just random. They're part of something bigger. If you ever hear stories like these from other drivers, pay attention. What happened once will happen again. Keep your doors locked. Whether you're in your car or checking into a motel, always lock your doors. Most of the people in these stories had someone try to get inside. Some were lucky, some weren't. Keep moving. The safest place is often inside your vehicle, moving forward. If something feels wrong, don't pull over. Don't give whatever is out there the chance to catch up to you. Final thoughts. These stories aren't just horror tales to give you chills, they're warnings. The road isn't always safe, the night isn't always empty, and the worst thing you can do is assume it won't happen to you. If you've ever had a strange encounter on the road, drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. Maybe it'll help someone else stay safe. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching, listening, and supporting Enigma of the Unknown. Your engagement keeps this channel alive, and your stories are what make this community real. Stay safe out there, trust your gut, and remember, some roads are better left untraveled.